I'm Rick from Cartouche Classic Cars. On this video, we're back on a 69 Firebird. You saw in the last video, we removed the front and rear suspension, we mounted the car to the frame jig, and on this video, the plan is we're gonna cut off all the rusted metal. There's probably not gonna be too much left of this car. Now, before we go to cutting, I said on the last video when I was closing out, we need to take some frame measurements. We just kind of squared this thing off on the jig, but that still doesn't say for sure that the car's straight and everything's good. So what I ended up doing already, and I'll just go over a quick reference, was I basically have the 67 to 69 Camaro unibody specs. This is from the factory. So what we ended up doing then, I took a tram gauge. So if you don't have one of these, it's a very handy gauge. It comes with these pointers that you can adjust it in certain pinholes. It's got the measurement tool there, and the further out you go, the more it adjusts. So what I'll look at a measurement on this factory unibody spec sheet. We'll set that measurement, tighten it down, and we'll go underneath the car and we'll find those reference holes and cross it over. This is verifying that the car's squared. None of the frame rails are bent. We're also going to do it this way on the frame rail. You see the factory specs there. What I will also do, as we're building the car, this will come back out from time to time, and we'll also verify that things haven't moved, especially when we put the subframe on these cars. So that's that. What else we ended up doing, you see, we just threw this car on the frame jig, threw it by squaring it up and everything, but we didn't care about the height. You know, all these cars are different heights on my frame jig. Where we need to make sure though, we need to take this factory unibody spec sheet, and now we need to do some backwards math. So for instance, this car mounts right here at the frame rail. On this spec sheet, I'm 7 1/8 inches from the frame rail to there. On this spec sheet, we're showing right now that this is supposed to be 6 5/16. So that's 3/16 of a difference we are from the factory frame sheet. So what I end up doing from the measurement back here and the measurement at the rear frame rails, we just added 3/16. So that put our measurements at 18 5/8, looking right here, and 15 7/8. My 10-year-old did the math, so we're hoping that's all correct. But we took then basically a tape measure, dropped it down, made sure that was squared, and that checks out, and that basically shows the whole back of this car is exactly where GM wanted it. And I kind of figured that this car just had a rough life with the rust. It's never been in any major accident that it's going to show in the frame rail. So now that we verified that, let's get to cutting this car up. Hopefully that helps you. If you have a project, you don't need, you know, a frame table. You don't got to buy one from some company or anything. You can basically go off those frame references. And then what you can do too, as you're cutting, take your jig points or take your car points. And if you want to know, if you know you're going to cut the windshield pillars apart, measure it beforehand. Take a measurement there. Write it down. You know, take your top measurements, take any kind of measurement you want and take notes on certain key points. So when you put it back together, that's where you know in your notebook that this car has to stay. So we're gonna write a couple other things down, being that this is the first F-body that we're cutting completely apart. I'm gonna do the same thing. We'll take some reference notes and then we'll start cutting. So stay tuned and let's get this car cut apart. So while cutting this car apart, we're going to try to do it in a somewhat organized fashion. How I like to go about doing it is basically almost reverse order that GM would have assembled this car. So realistically, the roof would have been the last thing put on the car. It's going to be the easiest for when we're getting in the car, we're not hitting our heads. So we're going to just go ahead and we're going to rip around the roof with the cutoff wheel. You can see I'm trying to avoid the lead channel right here, but I kind of went down a little bit right through the lead channel, so I stopped and we'll just finish slicing the roof. I'm going to take out the rosebud on the torch. Normally I wouldn't put this much heat on these panels if we were keeping them, but these things, they're all destroyed, they're all junk. So what we're going to end up doing, we just high heat on it with the rosebud on the torch tip, and you just see we're melting the lead out. Be careful with lead. I have exhaust fans. You could see it blowing up and out, and I'm under the car, so I'm not really worried about breathing in the lead, but be aware of that. Now that we got the lead exposed and out, I can cut above the lead channel and get the roof off. At this point, now I'm going what's left of that seam that's welded to the inner structure, and I'm going underneath. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to just kind of outline the quarter panel with a cutoff disc. There's plenty of tools to go ahead and do what I'm doing. The reason I like the cutting disc the best is I can really focus on how far I go down, so I know I'm only cutting through one level of metal. So especially with the roof, I know the inner structure in this car is probably okay. I can focus the blade and just cut the outer skin structure. You never know what's behind some of these cars, especially if it's not one you're completely familiar with. So cut off disc, it's not the most efficient way to go as far as cost and everything else, but for the whole process, I like to just rip off all the outer structure with the cutoff disc. If you look, there's certain areas too, while I'm cutting this thing apart, that I know we're not keeping. For instance, the trunk drop-offs, the wheel houses, I'm just going through and I'm not even really worried about just cutting one level. If I cut 2 levels, no big deal. Once I got most of the outer structure removed, we're kind of doing this in just an organized process. Now I'm going to go back through with the chisel, the air hammer, and now I sharpen this blade really good on the bench grinder, and I keep it sharp because it'll start dulling out. But you see, I'm kind of working the factory spot welds around, kind of pushing left and right, and I'm just drilling, I'm hammering around them, and you see it's ripping up the excess, whatever was left of that roof skin. This is why I pulled the roof skin off, because it would be really hard to get to it from all different directions with the outer skins on. I'm going to do the same thing here around the drip rail. Don't forget the lead channel up there. I didn't show on the video. I also melted that out in the A-pillar. But we're going to go work down the drip rail. Same thing. The drip rails were rotted. There's rust underneath. I mean, you could see the whole inner structure on this car. It's not rusted through, but this is why you really have to pull the outer structure off on the car. It really exposes the inner structure, and really a lot of damage I see on these cars, E-body cars, B-body cars. They're all on the inner structure. It's just they weren't prepped very well back here. So I'm the type of person that most of the time we're going to remove the outer structure if the owner allows to, or like I said, if it was my own project. I also like removing the drip rails in the sense that it gives me more adjustability with my quarters and roof. I'm not stuck on the factory area, so usually they're rotted away, and the adjustability factor, it just makes it a no-brainer for me that if we're going to do a roof, most of the time we're doing drip rails. Now we got most of the roof and the quarter panels exposed. We're going to go ahead and work our way to the rest of the external body panels, the trunk, the deck filler panel, the tail panel. So you see right now I'm kind of just cutting around the trunk gutter area. I kind of kept all that stuff together just as more of a reference point. And with the tail panel, this is some of my old crappy work back in the day, all the Bondo and filler back here and the rivets. That was 100% me. So I kind of remember working on this when I was 17, 16 years old, kind of regretting some of the work I do, but hey, we all live and learn. But what I'm doing with the tail panel, I'm basically removing it in small sections because there is an inner structure of it kind of and then outer structure. Then we got that cross brace underneath the car on the back side of the tail panel that right now looking at it, it looks like I might try to keep it. I'm still unsure. So about some parts I'm unsure. We're just going to have to be extra careful that we just don't dig into it. Same thing with the frame rails. We don't want to hurt the frame rails at this point. We still need to analyze them because underneath the quick assessment on the lift, they didn't look that bad. So I'm hoping I could keep the frame rails. Also, these rear trunk tail panel bracket supports, you see I'm using the air chisel around them because we are going to want to keep them also. Now that we got the tail panel removed on the top and kind of peeled back, you could see this is that rear valance on the bottom inside that we're trying to at least save for now. We want to do an overall analysis of it. If we don't have to cut it off, we're not gonna. You could also see the Bondo coming out from the inside of the tail panel just poking through. There was a dent there, I think back in the day. I remember drilling all the holes for the slide hammer, just pulling them through and just smeared it with filler. You know, that's kind of how We used to do things back in the day, so I'm guilty of it. Even when I talk bad about other people's body work that on the cars that come in the shop, I too was guilty of it. Removing the deck filler tray, you could see just how much rust was underneath this. Again, another panel that just has to be removed for the job to be done right. Now on this inner structure, I'm going to go ahead and remove that drop down bracket that goes under the windows and back of these F-bodies. It's completely rotted away. I'm not sure about this deck filler structure. I might want to keep it. Same thing with the package tray on this car. It was cut, some of it where the speakers are. It's not perfect. It could be fixed. I'm unsure at this point whether we're going to put a package tray in this whole support area in the back. So what we're going to end up doing, we're basically removing it one piece. We drilled out all the spot welds so the air chill is not ripping it. So that's a way that you can save it. It takes a lot more time, but at least now if I can't find a package tray area in this whole back bracketry, I know I can just reuse what I have. If it's not expensive and I think about it, I'm probably going to go ahead and replace at least most of the package tray just because of the cuts in it and everything else. At this point, I'm just trying to make this car 100%, and what I could end up doing, I might donate this to someone else that's got a Pontiac or a Camaro. We're going to turn our attention now on the trunk floor itself. What I like to do when I'm starting to cut out a lot of these floors and everything else is I'm actually cutting around that trunk floor brace. I'm going to show you why in the future, but realistically, I know the new trunk floors come with that brace, but what I like to do, I like to trace around all the areas that aren't frame rails because there's a good chance that we might not use the aftermarket trunk floor brace. If the car's together and the spot welds and everything looks good on the car the way it is, just because you buy a part doesn't mean you have to use it if it comes as a kit. I've seen a lot of times on the aftermarket panels, some of this stuff isn't prepped between the frame supports that they have on their floor pans and the floor pan itself. So that's something I would like to, if I could prep my own car and keep it, well, we go that route and we'll just pull it off the new floor, and then I can get in there and just put the skin itself on. We removed the trunk latch on it, and now you could see the center around the frame area is pretty much out of the car. When cutting these cars apart, I just think removing them in small workable sections is the way to go. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to run the cutoff wheel right down outlining the two frame rails front to rear. When cutting these cars apart, you really need gloves. You can see right now, I just took the gloves off for a minute while I'm using cutoff wheel, just because I'm letting my hands breathe out. It's 90 something degrees out here, but you see I put the gloves back on. They're going to really start cutting your hands. I'm just using an old TIG weld set of gloves that really were junk for welding. And at this point, you see, what I'm going to do with the Wheelhouses, I'll take out the plasma cutter. I don't really use the plasma cutter as much because anything behind it, it's going to destroy. So like I said, especially the outer skins or structure, if I don't know the car that well, I can sit there and I can cut a bracket, and it's just going to create so much more work in the future. So, but I know these Wheelhouses, they're going to be a pain in the butt to get that cutoff wheel in there and go around all the brackets and everything. So this is an area right now where I will take the plasma cutter, again, in a well ventilated area. This car's got a bunch of undercoat on the wheel wells just caked in there, covering the rust and everything else. But you could see I'm also wearing plasma cutting glasses, so these are actually like a welding style sunglasses, a little bit less tinted for the plasma cutter. But just be aware, if you're using a plasma cutter, it is almost like a sense that you need some kind of shaded protection like you would see on a welding. If you notice, I left the bottom trunk hinge support brackets. I'm going to leave those on the Wheelhouses. Again, this is probably one of those parts, it's probably not even worth saving it for the price of new brackets, and we don't care about originality in this car. We'll probably go ahead and replace that too. But I left it on there. I'm not going to throw any of these parts on this Firebird away until the car's metalwork's done. So I can always go back to the pile of parts and just grab that bracket. If I can't find it, I can't need it. Same thing on the Wheelhouse on this side. We're just tracing around all the brackets that I'm keeping, and we're going to just drop the Wheelhouse. It's a slow process. We got to make sure we cut in all different areas, but all in all, like I said, the plasma cutter, it does work really good for this situation. The idea is just to have all the tools you can at your disposal, that you're going to pick this tool for this area, this tool for that area, and just whatever makes your life easier. Also with the plasma cutter, just be aware if you're cutting into these old cars that it doesn't have leaves sitting in it. dead mice. You know, there's a bunch of stuff that if you hit the inside with this plasma cutter, you're going to be in for a surprise. Now we got the whole trunk, quarter, wheelhouse, pretty much the whole back of the car removed. We're going to go ahead and expose the frame rails to really get a good assessment of everything on the back of this car. We still haven't made a decision on the frame rail, so we're just ripping them up. And look at the inside of that floor pan where the frame rail is. Do you see how rusted it is? This is, like I said, why I said we got to take as much of this car apart to really do the restoration properly, because every seam on this car at this point you could pretty much guess is going to be completely rusted like that. The car just, it sat for too many years. The preparation, they weren't designed to last 50 plus years when they were built. So right now, to really restore this thing, we have to disassemble most of it. And the more we find, the more we want to take apart, I feel, to do the job properly. Even if we are going to keep the brand new cross bracket going in between the frame rails with the shock tower on the trunk support for these F-bodies, I would say I would still remove the floor pan this way. It's easier to peel the trunk skin off the frame cross members, even if the pieces have it, and then we could come back through, cut the bracket, or just drill out the factory spot welds, and you're removing one piece at a time. If you try to remove 3-4 pieces at a time, you're just gonna tire yourself out, damage your tools, and really you're not going to make it anywhere. It's just you're going to damage other parts of the car because you're pushing so hard on it. Even right here in this section you see in the center, that's 2 or 3 pieces of metal, and I'm working out, I'm getting it, but we did kind of hurt the panel a little bit more underneath. I couldn't find the factory spot weld, so again, that's another thing. You got to be aware that there's going to be some parts you're going to damage coming off, even on the parts you're going to keep. That's just part of the process. These cars were not designed to just take apart. So what you'll have to do, we'll have to go back through. You'll see once we start cleaning it up and after we sandblast and everything, you assess the situation and what you're keeping. We're going to go back through and we're going to just fix them. We got hammer and dolly a bunch of this stuff flat again, because hitting it with the air chisel is just going to distort it and everything else and just send it, you know, not straight. So hammer, dolly, we'll go over a lot of that in the future, but just be aware of that. What we're trying to do now, we're trying to just preserve the car as best we can while we're taking it apart. So the same process I use for the trunk floor, we're going to use same thing on the floor, work on our way forward. I'm just cutting around the frame rails. There's a couple brackets again on the front of those frame rails that are going to come with the front floor pan section, but we don't know if we're going to use them or not. Once we got that area out, I'm just going to work my way from now the front of the car, and the reason being that floor pan kind of goes under the dashboard, and it's just going to be harder to cut with this whole dash assembly in the way. We're going to be hitting our head. So now we're going to address the front of the car. Again, we're kind of just doing this in reverse order that I would go ahead and assemble in this car. So the dashboard, the floor pan would be in the car, and really the whole structure underneath in the car would be in before the dashboard. And you could see underneath that it was completely rotted away. This gave me a little bit more room to cut the floor pan. What I did, I took the spot weld, removed the cutter, and I cut the floor brackets out. We're not actually hurting the floor brackets, and I sliced underneath, and then I sat there and ripped down both sides of the floor. You can see I pushed in the middle and just had to work it, and that one last piece, once it let go, it came out with no problem. Now we have to go back through with the air hammer and remove all the edges on the inner rocker, but this gets the rough structure out. Right now we're going to try to take the firewall out, and we're going to do the front firewall first. We're going to try to remove it with the upper cowl panel too. So what I'm doing, I'm kind of cutting the access holes where I can cut the lower portion of the firewall from the inside of the car, and you see we're just kind of peeling it back. I left the 2 front brackets on the car again and just cut around them. You see they're just going to be, they're in the car and they're support brackets, so they're going to be a little bit harder to remove than this outer skin structure. So again, here we are with the plasma. It's a curved area. I blew the leaves out of the bottom already, so we'll just go ahead and we'll just cut down these 2 side areas that are completely rusted away too. Also, if you notice, I did take my measurement across my A-pillars, and I also have some small square tubing, just kind of holding it in place. This doesn't have to be major. I mean, I'm going to have some adjustability. We'll go back through and we'll check our measurements, but this is just to make sure the car stays kind of squared up, and mostly for transport. I mean, no one's going to be driving this car, no one's going to be hanging on the car, but we did want some support holding what we got, because as you could see, really at the top structure of this car, there really isn't too much left. The bottom I-beams are doing most of the load carrying and holding this car together. And you could see the car wiggles around a little bit when I'm hitting it and wailing on it, but for the most part, our little supports are going to just kind of keep everything in place. So, and we want that little bit of adjustability. We're going to come back through, we're going to test fit our bodies on here and just make sure everything doesn't move. Be aware too that as you're cutting apart this car, you're going to have to add support to it. The idea behind what I like to do on supports is I like to add the supports in areas that they're really going to stay on there as long as possible until I put the new parts on. But they're also, I don't want them in the way too much. So that's why we put the supports on the windshield. You're going to see in the future we got to remove some more, it looks like, parts that we're going to add a couple more supports on there. I also said through this whole process we're going to be taking measurements of the car and reference points. Well, here's a good reference point. With the frame jig being level, both the door pillars are also leveled at the very top. So we're going to use this in the future when setting our panels back together. Wow, so this escalated quickly, but here we are. We got the Firebird cut down. I'm going to kind of go over so you just don't think there is a method in the madness. So what we ended up doing, I realized after looking at this, these frame rails, they're not going to be saved. We're going to just buy new ones. I mean, really, we got rust in this back corner. We got rust in the front brackets that the floor pan would be on. We got rust in the frame channels themselves. There's just rust everywhere, and I think when we blast them, we're just going to have to do patches upon patches on these frame rails. I mean, if they are not available, it could be fixed, but where we're at, as much as we're replacing, we'll go ahead and do that. Same thing with this rear inner balance, that it's just, let's just put new. The whole back of the car will be new. So we did have to modify our jig. Like I said, as you go along, the build might adapt and kind of just morph to something else. So what we ended up doing, I cut these braces that was kind of holding this to the frame rail, and what I did, I put these outside bars going all the way down to the frame jig. That really has stiffened up the whole back of this car and is going to hold us where we want. Now, what I also did back here, and I'm going to show you, we're going to take this apart and then we'll come back and I'll show you, we actually jigged up off the shackle these supports back here, and then I cut the rest of the frame supports off, and I made jigs in the front off the leaf spring mounts. Again, I'll show you those in a second. So what we're going to end up doing, the idea behind this is, and it's going to save us some time too, we're going to leave all these pieces on this frame rail rear section. It's already cut off the rockers, and I kind of supported those, and me and my wife are going to go ahead and we're going to lift this off one piece, and then we're going to come back, I'll show you our jig points, and we'll kind of go over some other stuff before we finish up this car. Not only will taking this whole frame assembly, one whole entire unit apart, save us a bunch of time, but it's also going to be a great reference point that I can go back through as we're building the car and laying the new parts in, and I could take measurements off this just to verify all our new pieces are going together with the factory specifications. So this really is going to help us, I think. All right, so this is what we did for the front. These are the leaf spring mounts that came out of this car. They're junk anyway. I mean, I had to cut the springs out. The bolts were messed up to it. What we got, the frame rails will sit on our original brackets that we mounted the car on. So when we put our new frame rails, ideas are going to sit in here. One of these bolts for this is a very crucial piece, this leaf spring mount. One of the bolts will go into a frame rail. One will go into the front floor support in the back, and then that will also be the floor support here. So that's going to kind of hold everything together. And I don't know if you could see it, but basically I got a bolt coming off the back of this thing that's welded to the inner rocker too. So we're going to keep that there. I'm going to just cut around it, and honestly, when I put my new frame my floor pan in here, that one section is just going to be notched around it, and I'll just kind of weld it just because it's going to be easier to hold everything together. So that's the idea behind these two mounts. This mount right here, these are just mounts that the frame rail is, I got to clean that up. It kind of ripped up the welds, but This is going to be a generalization where it's the frame rail will just kind of sit on there. And how I did it, I know these pieces are centered. It's the same width of the frame rail, so it's going to sit. If I have the frame rail over a ½ an inch, I know we have an issue. And in the back, you can see the shackles will go right against this curvature right here, and the frame rail will drop right in that area. And then we're just going to center the rear inner balance and everything. So let's go look at some of the rusted parts and everything, because I know at this point this car's pretty stripped. And you know, a lot of times people will be upset. You know, we get cars in here, and be careful what you wish for, because people say, oh, I want a rust-free car, I want everything fixed 100% correct. Well, then their car ends up looking like this, and we still have to cut off the outer rockers. They are also rusted. But we get to a point like this, and we're just removing the rust. I mean, this is what you got to do to get a rust-free car. So, but a lot of times the car doesn't look as bad. And if you're not prepared for this, it is a real eye-opener at this point. So if you really plan on doing one of these cars and taking them down, and you want them true, built without filler, rust-free, the proper way that everyone says, be prepared for this. It's a big undertaking, and like I said in the beginning of the video, it really isn't worth it. You're going to have a lot of money in these cars, but if you're keeping them from time and time again for many decades to come, really this is the way you want to do it. So let's go look at some of the rusted parts, and I'll show you what we cut off on this car. So this is a lot of stuff that we cut off on the car. Like I said, I'm not making up where the rust is and everything else. A lot of this rust, you can't see until you start cutting. Obviously, some of it was pretty obvious, but it's even worse too. If you think about it, the car, I mean, it was in a rough state, but a lot of these cars have filler and fresh paint covering them. And underneath, believe it or not, a lot of this stuff is hidden under the carpet, behind the dashboard, behind some filler that's slapped on, and the car's done as a flipper car 5 years before, and it starts deteriorating. But you could see, I mean, this thing was all rotted out under there. Same thing, there's a dashboard. We went over the frame rails. Here's some work that I didn't do, but you could see where they riveted a quarter panel on top of the other quarter panel. So this would have been the original quarter panel, and then this is the Camaro skins we talked about. The trunk pan just rusted out in the back. Like I said, we're looking, here's some of the spots that where the frame rails were, and then we have our wheelhouses that are all rusted and everything else. Back here, looking, like I said, here's our deck filler panel. It looks decent from this side. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, you could see some rust around the edges, but I guarantee you this was going on for years and years before this car was falling apart. So all in all, this is pretty much what a 69 Firebird looks like in pieces, minus a little bit of the inner structure. So like I said, what we're going to end up doing, I'm going to pile all this stuff, keep it, we're going to put it back in the woods, kind of hidden away till the car's finished, because what's going to happen is we're going to need a certain small bracket on something, so we're going to have to come back through here and we'll have to dig that part out of the pile. And that's why I also try to keep the pieces small enough that I can manage them and take them off, but large enough that I can look at the whole dashboard assembly without cutting the brackets. There's a bracket that we might for some reason need. So that's the idea. Let's get to cutting the outer rockers. Again, they're rusted all on the inside, and that's our last piece for the most part. We'll cut them apart. We got to clean and grind all the edges on the panels where we were air chiseling stuff off, and then we'll kind of do a quick wrap up on the video. So like I said, we're going to turn our attention to the outer rockers. At this point, there's a bunch of filler caked in the bottom corner. The inner bracket on the outer rockers under the window channel support is all rotted away. So all that really has to be done. There's other problems with this outer rocker. There's stuff stuck inside it. It's just at this point, it's going to be easier to remove the outer rocker. I am going to leave part of the outer rocker on the front door pillar. That section we'll just kind of cut and section in. It's going to be a lot easier, and the job will come out, I think, just as good. So what I decided to do, we're going to do a cutoff wheel. We'll get the rough cut, coming in with the plasma, and we're just going to roll them back over. You could see on this side, it's the same concept. I'm going to kind of take the outer rocker apart in small sections. Like I said, the cutoff wheel does a nicer job up top. And then what I'm going to have to do, we're going to go back through and we're going to drill out all the spot welds, and then we'll come back through with the air chisel. You need to make sure you drill out these spot welds because the rocker panels are a lot thicker metal and the air chisel won't do it alone. Remember what I said about the rat's nest and everything coming out? There was a bunch of rat's nests and dirt in those outer rockers. The last two parts that we also have to pull off on this car is the rest of the quarter panel. On these GM cars, the Nova was the same way that I did. The quarter panels actually come with the door jamb area attached. So we just drilled out the spot welds, go into the back bracket, separate it from the inner window support, and we just air chisel out. Like I was saying, we pre-drilled all these holes on the outer rocker structure, and then when we come back through with the air chisel, we can just rip them right through. If you don't do this, it's just going to dull your air chisel and you'll be there all day. You do more damage. What also is nice, now we have our spot weld holes from the factory that when we put the outer rocker on, we're going to just plug weld those holes with a rosette weld with the MIG welder. So already it kind of saves a little bit of time. How I try to drill it, I drill it on the hole in the panel I'm keeping, so then the excess where you would have to grind out is coming off on the outer rocker. Same thing with this door jamb. It was the same process the other side. We just separated all around. We pre-drilled all the spot welds, and we're coming through with the air chisel, working our way up, and just gonna tear it off the car. Once we do that, we're pretty much gonna wrap up this video, and that's gonna be it for the disassembly. All in all, the car's pretty tore apart as it is. All right, so we're gonna wrap up the teardown video of the 69 Firebird. I still got a lot of work to do in cleaning everything. You can see all these edges right here. We pretty much have to get the rest of the metal off of it. What I also am gonna have to do, I'm gonna have to hammer and dolly all these edges after grinding them down to make them just straight. And then what all these little holes in here, we're gonna weld up before we go to sandblast. Another thing, if you look, you wonder why there's vice grips right here. I didn't even touch this bracket. All the time, I get panels like this coming from, this would have been a factory panel, nothing's touched it, and you see all the spot welds. There you go, it fell right off. So the spot welds didn't come through and protrude enough on that factory bracket. You could see we didn't drill any of them out. So we'll go ahead and fix this. We got a lot of work to do on the car. We did a lot of work, we stripped it down. Like I said, if you're planning on doing a major restoration where you want everything fixed, be prepared for this level. We got the outer rockers all the way out. We got on the other side down here, there's a couple more patches we're gonna do. But like I said, the next step, we're gonna go ahead, I got my parts list on order. That's what I've been doing. I got a piece of paper that I'll go through and I'll check off what parts I need, what parts I'm gonna have to order, and make notes. We have that list built together. At this point, I know what's gonna be all right, what's gonna work and what's not gonna work. So the next step, like I said, we're gonna clean this up. When I come back on the next video, we're hopefully gonna wet blast this car. This will be a good candidate to wet blast whatever's left of it. We have the front subframe and stuff to do too. So we'll wet blast the car. We'll get an epoxy primer, and then hopefully with how parts are nowadays, hopefully the parts come pretty soon and we'll start assembling this car. As you can see, we don't have a lot to work with. On the good note, when we put it back together, we pretty much know the car is going to be a brand new 1969 Firebird. So stay tuned. If you like our content and everything and this build, follow along, subscribe to our channel. Feel free to comment. It really helps us out. So like, comment, subscribe again. Thank you very much. And I'm Rick from Cartridge Custom Cars. We'll see you on the next video.